13 staff, subs, and contracted services. In this video, we'll be going over the COVID-related procedures for the school year starting in 2021. Those of you that have been existing staff members are familiar with our procedures from last year. So I will also point out what has changed and what remains the same between last year and this year as we go through these procedures. You should make sure that you download and have access to a copy of these. It's about 6.5 pages. There are 3 pages of appendices, so the text and procedures alone are about 3.25 pages. We do ask that you access these and read them prior to working in our schools. And they are available under the staff tab on the RSU 13 website, and you will see them linked there as COVID-related procedures. So first thing to point out is that should anybody test positive for COVID-19, we ask that they call the RSU 13 COVID hotline, which is highlighted right here at the top. It's 207-593-3541. So that's inclusive of our staff testing positive as well. You would give that number a call. Pre-screening tool, we used the pre-screening tool last year. It's the same process and procedure here, which is basically asking all of our staff and anybody that enters our school or that enters our transportation that they do the pre-screening prior to entering any of our RSU 13 property. The pre-screening tool has changed slightly from last year to this year, so please make sure that you're using the most up-to-date copy. We're asking all of our students, and again, anybody that enters our property, to do the pre-screening protocol. By clicking on the link here, it will take you to Appendix A that takes you to the screening tool. I will scroll down briefly to the screening tool. It's linked here as a PDF. And again, just reminds all of our staff, students, subs, contracted services to do this daily prior to coming to school or entering transportation. It asks, within the past 24 hours, have you had a fever or taken fever-reducing medicine? That's for the purpose of a fever. If the answer is yes, then you will not come to school. That does not mean if you have taken acetaminophen for a sore arm or a sore muscle, if you took that the night before, that does not mean that you can't come to school. So really the same logic applies to how we were applying this tool last year for those of you that were with us last year. Next question is, do you feel sick, had vomiting, diarrhea, fever, sore throat, or felt unwell? If the answer is yes, we ask that you not come to school. Same thing here, applying the logic of if this is a new symptom that has arisen and you should know your own body. If you know that it's not related specifically to your allergies or some other common ailment that you have had that's an ongoing ailment, if it's a new symptom and you're suddenly feeling unwell, we're asking that you stay home. Have you been told to stay home and isolate and quarantine due to a COVID-19 exposure? If the answer is yes, then you will need to stay home. And this just outlines again that we're asking that if you have a yes response to any of these, that you stay home. And we do have a process and protocol here for if a student is out sick and does not pass the pre-screening tool, this is what they will follow. For our staff members that are unable to pass the pre-screening tool, this is very similar to what we had outlined last year. So the process is right here. You'll notify the school through an email to your administrator, school nurse, and admin assistant to let them know your symptoms. Make sure you record your absence in Frontline, and you will use a COVID-related reason. So you will use a COVID sick day, or if you're asked to quarantine, it will be a COVID quarantine. And then we will reconcile any of those COVID-related days and sick time as the year continues, the same way that we did this last year as well. And then we will also ask that you're contacting your healthcare provider for input on next steps. If a test is ordered and once that test is performed, you will not return to work until your test result is received. The employee will then share their test result with the school nurse, who will verify and document it. And then if you need to be out for a series of days, you'll follow your contract with when to submit your doctor note to your building administrator. So I will jump back up here. That's the pre-screening tool. The next section here is masks. We have our RSU 13 mask policy linked here. Masks are required indoors for all unvaccinated and vaccinated staff and students. Masks are currently not required outside, and we are continuing to monitor what's happening in the landscape around us. If any changes are necessary to the masking policy, we will ask the Health Protocols Committee to reconvene and make recommendations to how we should proceed should anything need to change. It's also possible that we might have a mandated change that comes as one of the governor's orders. So that's another reason why we might have to make a quick change to this. And we encountered that last year. We started out the year very similar, and then masks were suddenly required outside. We're hopeful that that does not happen this year, but I just want to give people a heads up that there are ways that this language might change throughout the year, just as we had to be flexible and make changes last year. Anytime there's a change, we will notify our staff of that change. Students and staff are required to wear a mask on all transportation. This is currently a CDC requirement. The language that is outlined here is also echoed in our mask policy, and we're asking that face coverings thoroughly cover the mouth and nose. There's language here on what an appropriate face covering includes. It does not include the use of a bandana or a gaiter. Swap out any damp or soiled masks, and please encourage the students to do this as well. We do have additional disposable masks available in classrooms. If at any point you need your stock replenished, please reach out to your building administrator. They'll work with your custodian in order to get you what you need. Although face shields are an option, they have to be documented by a medical practitioner. Face masks and face coverings should be provided by families, but again, we do have extras available within our buildings. Continuing on, distancing. Students and adults are encouraged to maintain 3-foot distancing as feasible while indoors. The big difference here between language of last year and language of this year is the words as feasible. And that they are encouraged. This is not a requirement this year. Part of that is due to the masking protocols that were in place, and that there were very few instances of transmission within schools across the state due to those masking protocols. So distancing can be more flexible, particularly if there is universal masking in place. It also says if eating inside, students will continue to be distanced 6 feet where feasible and no closer than 3 feet. So they must be 3 feet or greater distanced while eating indoors. We do require seating charts for all of our indoor lunches, because that is a time where we have to look at the perimeter around students and look at that 6 feet or closer when we're looking at lunches. This would also include transportation. This would also include times during band class, because those are places where students might be closer than 6 feet and more likely for possible transmission. So in those cases, we would need to have seating charts, because we potentially may need to quarantine students in those situations. Next is hand hygiene. There's lots of videos out there available on hand hygiene. In a nutshell, we're asking that all students and staff practice hand hygiene before and after getting on and off the bus. We have hand sanitizing stations on our buses now, upon arrival to school, before and after eating, after using the restroom, before and after using shared or playground equipment, and before dismissal. For cleaning and disinfection, we're asking our custodians to regularly clean high-touch surfaces throughout the school day, just as they did last year. We're asking other staff to help support this effort within classrooms as possible. You will be provided with wet wipes in every classroom so that you are able to wipe your desk down. It does not specify when and how often to wipe your desk down, but we just ask that you be aware of student movement throughout the day and when it might be necessary to give those desks an extra wipe. Drivers will be cleaning and disinfecting their high-touch surfaces on their bus. They're also going to require the use of hand sanitizer and for students entering and exiting the bus. Shared materials will be cleaned after use and, to the extent possible, making sure that students have individualized materials. This is the same language that we used last year as well. So just trying to minimize opportunities that students are sharing things within a classroom, but I do want to point out that these are less restrictive than last year because the studies have shown that the virus is less likely to be on surfaces, so not quite as rigid of an expectation as we had last year, but still an added layer of caution. Ventilation in outdoor spaces. So RSU 13 has ensured ventilation systems operate properly. We're ensuring that regular maintenance is performed, so filters get changed out on a regular schedule per our contract and agreement with the company that we're working with. Our systems are currently all operating properly and functioning properly. We have an air exchange system that is wide open in order to pull in fresh air into our buildings. We do ask that schools, staff try to encourage outdoor play and the use of outdoor spaces as much as possible because we currently are less restrictive in terms of face coverings for students being outdoors. Windows on buses will need to be down as much as possible. There's a specific section on transportation that specifies which windows have to be down during transportation. Vaccinations. This is new for everybody from last year. So under the DHHS Declaration of Public Health Emergency, Maine schools are required to collect vaccination status of all employees and students and report that information. We're not reporting it by employee, we're reporting it by percentage of each school, and we have to report that information monthly. There will be, it says this information is accessible here. There's a link there. Currently, that link takes you to all of Maine school districts and shows the number of students vaccinated. Soon it will also show the percentage of staff vaccinated in each school as well. So that's the link that will continue to be updated by DHHS. We will also continue to partner with Maine Health as possible to offer and educate staff, students, and families on vaccination opportunities as we can make those available. Pooled testing, this is a new section in comparison to last year. Pooled testing was made available at the end of last year. You'll note, as it says here, that we are not currently planning to participate in the state's pooled testing program. Transportation and field trips. We're not limiting field trips as we limited them last year, but please also know that there are budgetary implications, so you do need to speak with your building administrator for any planned field trips that you might be considering this year. If you do plan a field trip, a seating chart is required on transportation at all times. Students and staff are also required to wear a mask on all transportation. Again, that's a CDC requirement. And then also the hand sanitization upon arrival and departure off of the bus. This section here also notes that buses will travel with 2 windows in the front open and 2 windows in the back open at minimum. And the suggestion is 1 on the right side, 1 on the left side in the front, 1 on the right side, 1 on the left side in the back. Buses can also open the air vents in the top part of the buses. During inclement weather, the 2 windows in the front and 2 windows in the back should remain cracked in order to allow for airflow and to try to keep those buses as ventilated as possible. Again, we are still requiring seating charts on buses at all times because that is a place where we may possibly have to quarantine students. Same for band and music. So Indoor and outdoor choral and instrument play is allowed. We do need to follow these guidelines. Chorus singers will be required to wear a face covering and have 3-foot distancing, with 6-foot distancing if feasible within the classroom space. If chorus is singing outside and is 3-foot distance, they will be wearing a mask, a face covering as well. Band requires wind instrument bell coverings and 3-foot distancing with 6-foot distancing if feasible for wind instrument players only. So that does not include your drum players, your piano players. So those players can be placed closer together if necessary, if you're trying to get your spacing to work. Those players, if they are non-wind instrument players, they would be required to wear a face covering at all times. Your wind instrument players would be required to wear a face covering only when they're not playing their instrument. So if they're not playing a full song, they don't need to put the face covering back on when they're resting between measures. Just like at lunch, they will be appropriately distanced because students are not wearing their masks at lunch either. But this is also the reason that we are asking that a seating chart is required during band time. Any performance that is allowable will have to follow the guidelines that are listed in this section, and then also be 6 feet from the audience. So the performers will need to be 6 feet from their audience members, and any audience members that are in attendance will need to follow all of the visitor language that's outlined in the next section below. Should we have any gathering restrictions? Currently we do not. We will need to abide by any gathering restrictions that are outlined to us from the governor's office. Next section is visitors and volunteers. Visitors and volunteers are allowed with the approval of a building administrator. There is a process here. Any of our visitors into our buildings, which includes parents on meet and greet nights, are required to use PPE. Just as outlined in our policy, that anybody entering our building or our schools will need to wear a face covering. They should also complete the COVID-19 self-check, the pre-screening protocol, which again is linked here in Appendix A, prior to entering our building. The same goes for contracted services, the same goes for subs, and all of those need to be approved by administrators, who will also be working with their staff to have discussions about safety precautions around events such as meet and greets, open houses, performances, and conferences, and any other such activities. So please be sure that you are working with your building administrator to provide some problem-solving ideas. The student out sick section, this does not necessarily apply directly to staff. Our nurses are very well versed in this section, as I believe probably our administrators and admin assistants are as well, because we've been giving lots of information to families. Really the only thing that's changed about this section is the pre-screening tool has been updated and no longer lists the most common or less common symptoms. We do outline here that once a COVID test is performed for a student, that families do need to share those results with us. Employee out sick section I have gone over. And the last two sections here, isolation, we will be maintaining an isolation room, although it's not a current requirement for being able to open schools. We found it was a good practice. It does not have to be a separate dedicated space that is only used for isolation. It can be another space that is used and cleared as soon as that space needs to be used by either a staff member or a student. We do have a child unwell protocol, so should your nurse not be in the building and you have a sick student and you're wondering what your next steps are, this links to Appendix B, which makes it really clear what your actions should be. So we are maintaining that. That is the same as last year. It does note the most common and less common symptoms on this, even though that's not echoed in the pre-screening tool. And part of that is because the nurse tool, which has also been updated, does list those most common and less common symptoms. That's linked here as well, and that's specifically for our nurses to use. This lists here what the school will do if we do have a sick child that needs to be isolated or a sick staff member that needs to be isolated. And then the next section here, it primarily just links to the standard operating procedure. If we have a suspected case of COVID-19, somebody calls that COVID hotline. This is the process that we follow. It's linked here. It was recently updated. The major update to this is that if we have a positive case within a classroom and we have universal masking in place with a policy, we will not have to quarantine. We will have to notify, which we will do through a one call to anybody that is a close contact. That includes staff, that includes vaccinated staff, that includes vaccinated students. Anybody who is a close contact will be notified, but will not need to quarantine unless we find that they were a close contact on a bus, in band, or at lunch. And those are all possibilities. It will depend on the investigation if we have to quarantine anybody in those three scenarios. The other scenario that we're looking at, but we're awaiting more clarification on, is after school activities, particularly with sports. But because most of our fall sports are outside, we are awaiting some additional guidance on what that means in terms of any possible quarantines. So, in a nutshell, that is this document. The only other piece that I did not go over, this is really more for our school nurses, is Appendix C. Our school nurses have been using this and are very familiar with this form. This is what gets sent home to a parent if a child is sent home from school for one of the most common symptoms or for showing two of the less common symptoms. So they will be continuing to use this form as well. Should you have any questions about any specific COVID-related protocols, I do ask that you reach out directly to me. I am Stephanie Tribo, the Assistant Superintendent. My email isstribo, STRIBOU, @rsu13.org. Thanks so much.